cannot tell you how much I disagree.
Oh, good. Let's go.
This is Joe versus Shanice special, bro. What are we saying?
I'm here for it.
What's going on, people? Hello and welcome to this week's Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with radical left-wing political parties in Britain. I'm your host, Jonas Marvin, and I'm here with my friends and comrades, Shanice McBean.
Hey up.
And Joe Todd.
Hey.
Okay, welcome everybody. Let's get straight into it and have a look at the party-related story of the week. Shanice, what have you got for us?
So the big news this week is earlier in the week, the House did an interview with Zach Polanski, and it turns out he's been in discussions with a handful of Labour MPs about possibly defecting from the Labour Party to the Green Party. And this is partly significant because, of course, the Greens just won massively against Labour in Gorton and Denton. And it's also sparked off, I think, quite an interesting and lively debate online about the pros and cons of Labour MPs defecting to the Greens. So immediately these debates kind of spurned some reports from other news agencies. So The Guardian reported that it was likely backbenchers on the Labour left who are dissatisfied with Keir Starmer's government. This isn't surprising. But also The Guardian reported that it's likely MPs that are going to face some electoral threat from the Green Party who are in these talks. So I think that's quite significant. And The Guardian also reported that members of Parliament who are in these talks with Zach Polanski have been asking for guarantees that they will be reselected for their seat in the next election in 2029. So obviously that raises quite interesting questions for the Green Party, particularly around selection processes, member democracy. But a couple of people that Zach said that he would work with, now he hasn't said explicitly in what capacity he would work with these people, but he has said that he'd be open to working with Nadia Whittome and Clive Lewis. So maybe just a couple of comments on these people. So, I mean, Clive Lewis is currently the Labour Member of Parliament for Norwich South, and Greens are actually quite strong locally in Norwich, got quite a lot of strength in the local council, and the Greens already the progressive alternative in Norwich, so they came second in 2024, for example. But I think it would be really interesting for the Greens to consider working for Clive Lewis. I think this raises all sorts of questions around, what would be the procedure that the Green Party should take for having these discussions with Labour MPs thinking of defecting, but also for members and the party more generally to be able to decide. If we look at Clive Lewis as an individual, he's been on the soft left of the Labour Party, for example. He's got quite a patchy voting record. So while he did vote against the prescription of Palestine action, he abstained on David Lammy's changes to jury trials. So he's got a bit of a patchy voting record. He's not typically he's not always part of the group of MPs who are kind of breaking the whip and voting against the government. But also it's a guy that's kind of mired in scandal. So a couple of notable ones to mention are when he was recorded at The World Transformed, saying to someone in the audience, "On your knees, bitch." And it was a jovial joke. And it was kind of, I think the attacks on him from the Labour right and Conservatives were politically motivated. This wasn't the only scandal he was part of. He was accused of groping someone at an event. And although that wasn't taken any further by the Labour Party, there are other rumours within the left movement of inappropriate behaviour. And also his response to those allegations was quite poor at the time as well. He talked about, it's just isn't it a bit weird, the idea of a man in power groping a stranger, a woman in a public place? And actually, no, that's not weird. That's often how that's how sexism works. That's how misogyny works. So his response to the whole thing, even though some of the attacks were politically motivated, his response to it was really poor, and his voting record is a bit patchy. So this raises questions, of what are the types of people from the Labour Party that the Green Party would want to have in. The Green Party prides itself on being somewhat decentralised, on having a more diffuse decision-making structure, and prides itself on being incredibly democratic internally. We contrast this to Labour MPs and the kind of political culture they're coming from. The Labour Party is a party that has a culture where power, maneuvering, backroom deals, and hierarchy win the day. And I think some of the people that have been suggested might be part of the list of MPs that Zach Polanski's talking to include people like Nadia Whittome. I think it's possible here that in Nadia Whittome's case, there's more of a case for bringing her into the Green Party. Again, she's in Nottingham East, where the Greens came second. It's got quite a high student population, mixed ethnic demographics. The Greens came second, as I said. So this is a place where, the sitting Labour MP is probably at some risk in the next general election. But also Nadia Whittome has, especially in kind of the last year or so, voted much more in alignment with the Labour left, not just the soft left, but the socialist left. And you can see that there might be a case both for her, from her perspective, of wanting to keep her seat, but also potential benefit to the Green Party there. Other people that might be in the running, Ian Byrne, Liverpool West Derby, but actually he has a really strong local reputation that probably can be a bit of a bulwark against Keir Starmer's government. And others might be kind of Belle Ribeiro Addy, who's in Clapham and Brixton. Obviously, the Greens are extremely competitive across the entirety of London. It's their natural and comfortable base. But I don't see Belle necessarily making that switch. And then other names might be John McDonnell, but the Labour Party is in his entire life. So don't see him making the switch either, even though he might be an asset to the Green Party. So I think there are, for me, many things that the Green Party would need to consider if it were to potentially accept Labour MPs defecting. It has a process that it uses for councillors defecting, and it can be quite a long process of kind of discussions and seeing how people have governed locally and chatting to local members. And I read the Green Party's constitution, and it doesn't appear to be an existing process for defections of MPs. Some things immediately that come to mind they'll have to consider is obviously voting history. You don't want someone who's going to be tarnished by some of the worst excesses of Keir Starmer's Labour government, from migration policy to two-child benefit cap. But also, I think a key one is office culture. What is the culture like in an MP's office? Are they going to be bringing quite a horrible hierarchical culture from the Labour Party into the Green Party? Or is their office somewhere that people actually like to work in? So, I've been told from people that Belle's office, Diane Abbott's office, John McDonnell's office, people consider them great places to work. Others less so. Individual behaviour. So, is this an MP who's been mired in personal scandal, or is this someone who just behaves well, doesn't abuse their power, isn't power hungry? Have they been publicly critical of Keir Starmer, or have they consistently been publicly critical of him, or have they only become publicly critical when the Green parties seem to be in the running for some kind of governmental position? I think these things are important. And just basic questions of, is there a values fit between Labour MPs and the Green Party? What are their views on member democracy? I think this idea that Labour MPs could move from being in the Labour Party and having a guarantee that they'd be selected for their seat in the next election, to me, just stinks of careerism and opportunism. The Green Party prides itself on having a democratic culture, and I think the Green Party would suffer from bringing in Labour MPs who undermine that. And I think the final thing to say is we actually have a test case for how some of these defections from one of the main two parties into one of the more insurgent radical parties and what that looks like in Reform. So, for example, the Reform Party has had defections from the likes of Nadine Zawahi, Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick, and this has actually damaged their brand somewhat, partly because the people that have defected have said critical things of Reform, quite highly critical things of Reform in the past. So Nadine Zawahi said not that long ago that he'd be frightened to live in a country run by Nigel Farage. And Robert Jenrick accused Reform's Zia Youssef of lying about immigration policy, and then also accused Nigel Farage of being a drunkard and smoking drugs for wanting to lift the two-child benefit cap. And then mere months later, months or years later, these are now people who are considered, serious politicians within Reform. And I think the response to the Reform base to this has been really negative. It's definitely damaged Reform's brand. And actually, the splitting of that right vote between now Reform and Restore, I think exemplifies the fact that an insurgent party doesn't have to remain insurgent. If it starts to be seen as part of the establishment, that could lead to splits and fractures and damage to the brand that might be unrecoverable. So, yeah, I think my position is there are a lot of people that the Green Party shouldn't touch with a barge pole, quite frankly. I don't think the Greens, the reason why the Greens are in a powerful position at the moment is because they're considered insurgent, is because they're considered distinct to the Labour Party, is because their brand is on the radical left and not the soft left. And I think a lot of damage could be done by haphazardly bringing in Labour MPs who are trying to save their careers and save their seats, as opposed to focusing on creating a strong new Green leadership.
Yeah, I agree with so much of that. I think that just on some of the process points, nobody in the Green leadership or in the Green staff team can guarantee any of them will have a seat. Like they can't do that. The only way they're able to do that would be to pass a motion of conference, which amends the constitution, and that's going to take 70% of conference to vote for it. It's very hard to get things on the conference agenda because it takes many years to build up because of the multiplier rule that they have. And I also just don't think that 70% of conference delegates would vote to change their very democratic selection processes to let in some Labour MPs. So no one's going to get a guarantee of a seat. That said, depending on where that MP was going to run and where they were already the MP for, it could be very easy for them to get selected as the Green candidate. So let's take Nadia Whittome, for instance, who I do think is probably one of the best candidates for moving over. She's in Nottingham East. Is it Nottingham East? Yeah, she's in Nottingham East. My understanding is that there isn't, a super, super strong Green presence in Nottingham East from the people that I've talked to, even though they did come second in the last election. And, if Nadia jumped ship and then spent a lot of time with the local party and demonstrated that she wasn't a twat, basically, and that she really wanted to work with them and got to know them all, I just think the culture in the party would be that they would select her because they want to, the Greens want to win, and this is an opportunity for them to win. And if you look at, say, Caroline Lucas's selection battles, so she had to get reselected every year. She was an MP, and there was never a serious challenge to Caroline because, why would you? She was the one Green MP. And I don't think it'd be as strong as with Caroline because Caroline was absolutely iconic within the party. But nevertheless, I think that thing of local members just wanting to win and wanting, a good candidate to become MP and then having a good candidate there who has been an MP will just be very, very powerful as long as that person's not, as you say, Shanice, mired in scandal or is like a nightmare to get on with. And it was actually one of the reasons why, although in Labour during the Corbyn years, we pushed really hard for open selections, there was always this understanding that open selections would probably not result in many deselections because actually local parties kind of liked continuity a lot of the time, even if their MPs were quite right-wing. What it would have resulted in is more disciplining of MPs because MPs can't just go off and say what they want because there's always the threat of deselection. And we already have that in the Green Party. I think to zoom out a bit and make the case for it, having these stories ongoing, so this debate about will these Labour MPs jump to the Greens or not, is brilliant for the Greens. It's a really, really good story to have in the press. It's a really good argument to be having amongst Green members. If this is the thing that we're arguing about with regards to the Greens, this is really, really good for them because it positions you as an insurgent force which is on the verge of becoming a force that can govern and can actually take MPs from the governing party. Whether you want it to actually happen is another question, but I think maintaining this tension that we have and the ongoing stories about defections are really, really good. And it's been a way that reform has kept this sense of insurgency and also kept them in the press. I think maybe the other thing to say is that I just don't think, if you're looking at it from a left Green perspective, there just aren't that many good candidates in a way. I did the same as you, Shanice, and I looked down the Socialist campaign group, and there's only 5. So Diane Abbott, Apsana, Begum in Poplar and Limehouse, Belrabir Addy in Clapham, Brixton Hill, Clive Lewis and Nadia Whittome. There's only 5 in which, according to electoral calculus, the Greens have more than a 50% chance of winning at the next election. So there's only those 5 left-wing MPs who have a serious threat from the Greens at the Greens' current level of polling. And, of those, Diane Abbott is likely to resign, I would guess, at the next election. So you're kind of left with 4. There are others where the Greens are strong, but not as strong. And even someone I'd have expected Olivia Blake, for instance, in Sheffield Hallam to be a real threat from the Greens, but actually, electoral calculus has it as quite a solid Labour hold, even at current polling levels. So we're actually not talking about many MPs Yeah, we're not talking about many MPs. And if we're talking about the Greens trying to win, at the level of trying to win 50, 60, 70 seats, like the amount of socialist MPs you kind of nick from Labour are not going to massively change the composition of the Green Parliamentary Party. Like if you're worried about the Green Parliamentary Party not having enough socialists in it, you should be looking at like Green Party selections and the Green Party kind of candidate pipeline and focusing on getting people in there, because it's a far more fertile ground, I think, than trying to look for Labour MPs.
Yeah, I think looking at things on a case-by-case basis is important. There are soft left MPs who were challenging for radicalism during Corbyn's reign in 2015 and 2019. We do, it just should just be mentioned, we've kind of alluded to it, the kind of incentive structure of Parliament, right? Which is that, it's quite cushy. You want a job. People who become MPs are relatively quite weird people and bring with them all sorts of baggage and challenges and egos and complications. And that presents problems. And, the kind of structure of the institution is governed by a wantingness to stay in it, to stay in the job and to seek re-election. And I think we have to kind of always bear that in mind when we have these kind of conversations. And for the Greens, there's a sense of how do you balance increased power, increasing dominance in the electoral sphere with your red lines, and a sense that you're not just repeating the path of contemporary Labourism. The right and the left is an interesting comparison, I think, because the Greens, I was reading an article, I can't remember where I read it now, have a bigger pull to fish in than Reform do when it comes to snatching Labour MPs, right? But also there's a much sharper ideological divide between the Greens and Labour than there is between Reform and Tories. So they're two qualifications that are worth bearing in mind. And the local elections are going to be a crucial moment for seeing some of this kind of stuff bear out, right? If that's utter collapse for Starmer and Starmer ends up going, and it could go either way, but one possibility is that you could see an exodus of a small number of MPs to the Greens, for example. One of the things that I worry about is, many Green members who went through Labour will know this. Those of us who have been your party members are astutely aware of this. And people on the Labour left will undoubtedly be quite rawly familiar with this. Labourism brings with it a cultural baggage and a set of fairly recent historical controversies that can ground down the effect of a radicalising project such as Polanski's Greens. And that needs to be something the left and the Greens are abundantly aware of, because the Polanski project is fresh, really fresh. It's not always clear what it thinks. It hasn't always worked out what it thinks on fiscal policy, on NATO, on foreign policy, on a bunch of different questions, right? And I do worry, I think, about the impact escaping Labour MPs could have on that, because I've seen the impact some of them had on Corbynism. And I just think, for all that it shows, this is a good conversation for the Greens to be having, that this reflects a kind of growing insurgency and an attempt to capture the kind of collapse of Labour. For all it shows that, we also know how quickly political projects can be shown to be seen very mainstream, right? We know the difference between, in 2017, after Corbyn outperformed all expectations in the 2017 election, I have this image seared in my mind of him walking into Parliament when it was brought back together and all of those MPs standing up to applaud him. And then they all spent the next 2 years stabbing him in the back. I'm not saying that history is going to repeat itself in the same way. The Greens and Labour are very different. I think you've both gone into quite good reasons why that's the case. But I do think tread cautiously as well, because I do think, obviously the point of an electoralist party, even on the left, like the Greens, is that it wants to govern. But if you want to get to that point where you want to govern, you do want to avoid the danger of being seen as too mainstream and too institutionalized.
Yeah, and I think that point that you raise about ideological dilution and the possibilities of that by bringing in Labour MPs is probably even more of a concern given the context of the Green Party, both structurally and in terms of who's leading it. In terms of structure, the Green Party went from having 60,000 members to now over 200,000 members in about a year. And that's fantastic in terms of the resources that the party now has, the capacity that the party now has, the influence that it will have in local areas, but also means that the party is in a real huge period of flux and change where the internal culture is probably shifting. There are probably some longer standing members who are more attached to the Green brand, who maybe feel a bit insecure and unstable in that changed kind of party environment. And actually the Greens are probably now in a process of figuring out, with all these new people, new members, kind of new ideas, what its identity is going to be moving forward. And I think, you know, a context where all that change is already happening, throwing in the baggage of Labour MPs from the top could potentially mean that actually, you know, members from below don't have that chance to figure out what the Green culture, what the Green identity is going to be moving forward. And I think the second thing is more personal about Zach, which is that, I've said this before, but he's a new political leader. You know, this isn't a person that has decades in the trade union movement or decades in social movement. And I don't want to undermine kind of the work that he's been doing over the last decade, but he's pretty green, actually. Being Green Party and also being fresh.
You paused for the laugh. You paused for the laugh.
You did pause for the laugh. That's true.
But he is fresh. And not only is he fresh, I mean, from my perspective, he doesn't seem to be rooted in any particular political tradition, which in some ways is a good thing because it means he can be dynamic and flexible and, you know, he's not kind of attached to any kind of dogmas. But then the flip side of that is that he's more susceptible to being influenced. And you chuck in some kind of Labour MPs who have had, you know, experience in shadow ministerial roles, or even who have had, you know, junior positions in government, or in Clive Lewis's cases, you know, had ambitions to be a leader. And you can see how those pipelines of influence could start to really hinder things from the top. And actually, you know, the entire leadership team, Marvin and Rachel, are not necessarily fresh to politics, but fresh to this kind of national leadership role. And I think in that context, chucking in Labour MPs just could be a disaster. And I think, you know, for me, Gorton and Denton shows that Labour voters are not afraid to not vote Labour. And Joe, I agree with you. It's important to kind of look at where the Green Party came second and where they're projected to come, maybe be a challenge in 2029. But also Gorton and Denton shows that even where they didn't come second, and even where we don't expect them to be a challenge, they can be insurgent. And so there are probably many more Labour MPs who should feel at risk than just those five.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify on that, there's many more Labour MPs who are at threat from the Greens. I was just looking at left-wing ones that are at threat from the Greens, because I was basically proceeding on the assumption that I don't want any Labour MPs who aren't left-wing to join the Green Party. Which, sorry, that probably should have been, I should have said that explicitly, but yeah, I do not want centrist Labour MPs to join the Green Party. I probably don't have to explain to the audience of this podcast why that. But that
also,
might be the
you know,
case.
just on that, one of the names that's been touted online as some Green Party member saying, "Yeah, I wouldn't mind if he was in," is Clive Lewis. You know, I don't think he's on the left of even Labour. He's this kind of like soft left. He's a proponent of what's called radical realism, and as my partner says, radical realism is much more realism than it is radical. It's just, you know, typical classical kind of the economics of the status quo with a bit of social justice chucked in. And I don't think the Green Party would benefit from that at all. And in fact, I think it would be deeply damaging. You know, I think for me, just thinking personally, if Zach Polanski was like, yeah, we'll have Clive Lewis in as an MP, I think that would significantly change what I thought of the Green Party and Zach Polanski's leadership.
I don't want to be the person to defend Clive Lewis because I don't know him, but
he
did.
Now.
I mean, like just as a counterpoint to that ideologically, like he did after Grenfell tweet a picture of Grenfell with burn neoliberalism. So he's not, you know what I mean? Like I think he says a lot of stuff that can point in like more and less radical directions, and I think it's probably better to understand him as like a bit more of a like confused character ideologically. Like to put him on the soft left in the way that you might put, who would I pick? Someone like Miata. I can't remember her second name. She's in the shadow cabinet now, in Rachel Reeves' shadow cabinet, and used to be the head of the New Economics Foundation. Like, I'd say she's a lot more solidly in the soft left of the Labour Party insofar as she is, you know, very happy to go and stay in a Keir Starmer cabinet, and she is like progressive on economic policy, but definitely doesn't have an orientation towards class struggle or anything like that. So I don't know. I think Clive might be a bit more complicated than that, but I really don't want to be. I don't want. I don't want to end up being the Clive defender. So please don't. So please don't respond to that point. The other, just the other thing that I want to say is that I think we just need left-wing MPs in Labour as well. Like the Greens might benefit from one or two people joining, but I just do still think there's a role for the Labour left, frankly, and I think the Labour left is a hedge against the Green Party potentially crashing and burning at some point because things go wrong or because some scandal comes up about Zach or whatever is important. It's likely there's going to be a soft left recuperation of the Labour Party, I think, after Keir Starmer goes. I think a lot of people on the left outside of the Labour Party are quite overconfident about how pissed off potential Labour voters are with Labour, and actually I think a lot of them could move back under the right leader, Andy Burnham. I'm not advocating for this, it's not what I want, but I think like the left having a presence within that is actually no bad thing. So I don't know, like I'm less scared of them joining because I think they're going to fuck up the Green Party, and I'm more a proponent of this kind of productive dynamic and tension between the Labour left and the Green Party. And if the Labour left just decamp and mass to the Green Party, then that tension disappears.
I just think, honestly, I'm a principles gal, and I think if there are Labour MPs who feel that the Labour Party is no longer a party that represents their values, then leave. Spend some time in the wilderness, like prove your grit as an independent MP. Get on with the job, make the case. Don't just sit in the Labour Party like blindly following the whip because you have to, because otherwise you'll get in trouble. Like, have some heart. If these are the values, if the Green Party have the values that you want to espouse, then defend them, leave. It's as simple as that for me. And those who don't, those who have waited till Gorton and Denton to start, thinking about should they defect or not, those who are demanding that they be reselected, I just have no time for them. Careerists, opportunists, get lost. Do your own thing.
I think the argument, look, that's a completely coherent argument for sure, but I think that is just an argument against the Labour Party as an institution, right? It's an argument against a party with socialists in it, as it's always been termed, and an argument against being in a party that is a coalition with social democrats and liberals and parts of the right. And I totally see it, but I just totally see the other argument as well, which is actually like, the Labour Party is this institution that's incredibly hard to overcome, and having a left presence in it's really quite important.
Look, none of the real, hardcore socialist MPs will leave. John McDonnell's not going to leave. Ian Byrne's not going to leave. Upsana Begum's not going to leave. Bell's probably not going to leave. And that's because actually, these are the people that consistently vote against Keir Starmer's government, and they benefit from that in terms of their local reputation. So it's not going to be those people who have been consistently voting the right ways, disobeying the leadership, breaking the whip. It's not going to be those people that leave. It's going to be the ones who flip-flop. It's going to be the ones who are like, oh yeah, maybe I'll vote against that, but I'm not going to vote against that because... And I don't think the Green Party will benefit from having those people.
I think the person you're referring to is Clive Lewis. And I think if you look at the top five who are most under threat from the Greens, so Diane Abbott, Upsana Begum, Bell Rabira Azzi, Clive Lewis and Nadia Whittome, I think the other four have, as far as I know, have pretty consistently voted against the whip.
Nadia Whittome's been more consistent recently. Historically, she's been a bit more inconsistent, but to be fair, so was Zara Sultana. historically Zara Sultana was more inconsistent, and she was also invited to join the Green Party last year and break from your party. So I don't think you should look all the way back through their 10-year voting record and be like, no, not that person, yes, that person. I don't think that at all. But you have to think about timing. Why is it after Gorton and Denton that this has now become a topic of conversation? I'm sure there have been talks that have been going on before, but if there are MPs who, are just starting to think, oh yeah, the Greens are electorally viable now, maybe I should think about jumping ship. Nah, bugger off.
I just have more sympathy for it, just in that I want the maximum amount of number of socialist MPs in Parliament, and if a seat is currently held by Labour, by a socialist MP in Labour, and that socialist MP thinks the Greens are going to beat them, then I kind of want that socialist MP to then be a Green MP so they stay in Parliament. And I think the other element that maybe we haven't included in this is that, the Greens are going to select for maybe like 100 to 150 seats that on like very good polling they could win if they push up into like the higher 20s. At the moment, it's like 50, 60, 70. Not all of those people they select will be socialists. It just that won't be the case. Like they'll select a bunch of liberals as well who have been around the party for a long time, who are councillors who have been queuing up to be MPs. So I don't think we should have this argument on the assumption that the alternatives would be more left wing than the people you might get from Labour, because they might well not be.
Yeah, that's fair. But then there's also the other things like transporting the Labour Party culture into the Green Party.
That I completely accept. Yeah. That I completely
And
accept.
I think there's a question here that defection sidesteps, which is how do you create a cadre of leadership fit for the projects that the Green Party want to run? And actually, there are rumours that the Green Party is struggling or would struggle to find solid candidates for each of the seats that it could potentially win and want to challenge. And instead of having this conversation about defections, actually we should be talking about caderisation and building a future leadership.
1,000,000%. I really, really agree with that. And I suppose just one last point on this, like, Shanice, you've emphasised this kind of like freshness of the Green project and how the Green Party is green. But I think that's really important in politics, like a sense of like energy and momentum and newness. It creates an affect and a vibe which can be very, very powerful. And although out of all of the Labour left MPs, John McDonnell is the one who I have most respect for, I do not think under any circumstance I'd want to see him in the Green Party now, because he was just too heavily associated with what is now perceived to be the failed Corbyn project.
Yeah,
he was the Shadow Chancellor, I'd say the same for Diane. So I have huge respect for these people, but I just think because they've been around that project and around the Labour Party for so long that it won't be a good look for the Green Party, really.
Yeah, I guess my final point is a counterbalance to that. And I'm not saying I hold this view, but it is a view that's out there. There will, I think, as we get closer to 2029 and the Greens become more and more dominant electorally, there will be questions on its ability and competence to govern. It's got quite an inexperienced leadership, hasn't got that many MPs, doesn't have a history of governing. And in some ways, that's a good thing, because you don't want the baggage of these ossified institutions that have governed and governed poorly. At the same time, the question of competence will become a bigger and bigger attack stick in the media. I suppose there's something there about learning from, the left-wing MPs that have had proximity to power, have had proximity or had ministerial roles. There's something in that, but I don't think that requires defections. There are other ways to pass on kind of movement knowledge and that kind of knowledge. And also not just from the Labour Party. Zach Polanski should be having conversations with, people who have been involved in Podemos, people who have been involved in Syriza.
I thought you were going to say the Lib Dems.
No! and other projects.
Where's Shanice going with this?
All right, time for our hot take. This is where we touch on a juicy and controversial topic important for left-wing political parties. Joe, I think you're up this week, mate.
Okay, so I'm definitely thinking aloud on this one. And it might be a bit of a long one, but it's basically related to the Green Party Spring Conference that's coming up at the end of this month. So it's the 28th to 29th of March, 1 day of training, 1 day of voting on motions. It's all going to be online. And I think my hot take is that, like, quote unquote radical policy motions are not the way we build a socialist party and win. And I actually think they're a bit of a dead end. And I'm going to explain why. So just to give the conference, Green Party conference, just to give the context, Green Party conference is coming up. And there's lots of motions going to the conference, some about changing the rules of the party, others about changing the policy of the party. And the big motion that's been trailed is a motion that's entitled Zionism is Racism. It's got hundreds of backers on the online platform, more than any other. And the content of it is lots of very sensible pro-Palestinian stuff, calling for the establishment of a single democratic Palestinian state, for the right to return of Palestinians who haven't been able to come back, the unbanning of Palestine action, the releasing of Palestinian political prisoners. So it's, content-wise, it's just like a very, very good motion. There was a similar motion that was put to a Green Party conference last year, and I'll show why they're similar in a minute, called Abolish Landlords, which again had really sensible policy on it. Actually, all of the policy that's contained in Abolish Landlords was already Green Party policy. So it was actually just a reiteration of the Green Party's existing housing policy. And, it pledged rent controls. It wanted to scrap right to buy. It wanted to levy business rates on Airbnb flats. It wanted to double the taxation on empty properties. It wanted to end buy-to-let mortgages. So, all really good stuff, very sensible stuff that we would want to implement if we ever got into government. So my problem is not with the content of these motions at all. I think the content of these motions is good. My problem is with both the framing and the logic behind them. So, both of these motions are very sensible, but they're obviously titled in these very provocative ways. So Zionism is racism, provocative statement. I agree with it, but provocative statement. Abolish landlords, provocative statement. I agree with it, but provocative statement. This was done because the people who are proposing these motions wanted to create a kind of a bit of a media storm and a furore around them, right? So they wanted the national media to pick up on the Zionism as racism motion and the Abolish Landlords motion and talk about these things in public. I mean, I chatted to the guy that pushed the Abolish Landlords motion, and that was very much the logic. It's, get it into the mainstream media, make the Green MPs they were then, or the Green spokespeople as they were then, so it didn't include Zach, speak to this and kind of shift the conversation, as it were, around housing or around Palestine, and shift the perception of the Green Party around housing and around Palestine. And I really understand that logic. I think it's very of our time. We live in a very attentional moment. We live in a moment where grabbing attention and being seen to be doing things feels like everything almost. And, I think the best expression of this on the left was in recent years has been Just Stop Oil, who were just kind of absolutely bathed themselves in attention as a way of accruing power. But I think it's evidence of, I would say, an unambitious theory of change and an unambitious politics. I'll explain what I mean by that. I think it's unambitious because I think it comes from a place where we're looking to change the discourse and the conversation rather than a place of trying to accrue power so we can actually exercise these things that we want to do. So we can actually abolish landlords or actually reorient the British state, to be against Zionism, right? I think it ends up being very discursive, and it ends up being, as I say, about changing the conversation, having a big conversation around it and getting it in the media and stuff. And I think my question is that, to what end are we getting it in the media? And does it actually hurt our ability to win? And I think a more ambitious theory of change that could be attached to this is starting from the premise of what would it actually take to abolish landlordism, I'll say, because I think that's a better framing. What would it take to abolish landlordism? And what would it take to reorient the British state around anti-Zionism? And I think it'd take many things. And we're a long way away from doing both of those. But one of the things that it would take in a purely electoral sense, because we wouldn't only need electoral power to do these things, but one of the things it would take in a purely electoral sense would be a Green majority. So a Green government, if we're thinking in terms of the Green Party, and a Green Party and a bunch of Green MPs that were left-wing and actually committed to doing those things, right? So they didn't just get in and renege on that. So a Green majority and a socialist Green Party, basically. Now, to get to a majority position, the Greens have to get to about 32% of the vote, 33% of the vote. It's very rough, but that is roughly what you need to be with a shot of getting a majority in our new multi-party system. At the moment, the Greens are anywhere from 11 to 19%. So that, depending on which poll you look at. So that is a huge jump. It's a huge jump. At the moment, if the Greens have any shot of government, it's as part of a coalition with Labour. You'd be a junior partner in that coalition, maybe in coalition with Andy Burnham or something like that. And there is no way that in coalition with Andy Burnham and Labour, we are reorienting the British state towards anti-Zionist ends, nor are we abolishing landlordism. That's not happening, right? We have to aim to be a majority party if we really want to try and achieve this stuff. So we have to take seriously the voters that we don't have yet, who we want to win over, right? We need to take seriously expanding our coalition. We need to take seriously everyone who's thinking of voting Green, currently votes Labour probably, or currently doesn't vote at all, maybe they vote Lib Dem, thinking of voting Green but aren't yet. There's a really useful piece of research that's come out on this recently from a group called Persuasion UK. They interviewed 9,000 potential kind of left leavers of the Labour Party. And I think it confirmed a lot of what we already know. Like, actually, the people who attempted to abandon the Labour Party in towards the Greens, they're not like all kind of like posh liberal elites that live in London. They're actually downwardly mobile graduates, many of them working service sector jobs, lower middle class almost. It was actually interesting that they were more white than the rest of the population. So I actually need to check that because I'm not sure if I got that right. But the third thing and the most interesting thing for this conversation is that they were quite open to moving back to the Labour Party if the Labour Party was seen as the most viable prospect of actually forming a government and stopping reform, and the Labour Party shifted to the left somewhat under a figure such as Andy Burnham. And I just think that, like, if we're thinking about those voters for a second, I'm definitely not making the argument that what the party needs to do is rein in radicalism. I don't believe that at all. I think that we need to be very radical compared to the current status quo. But I think it needs to be a radicalism that's rooted in how people speak and their everyday concerns. And, you know, just as an example, Zoran Mamdani, who we use as a crutch on this podcast all of the time to make our argument stronger, and I'm going to do it again, he did not argue for the abolition of landlordism or landlords. He argued for freezing the rent. Now, like, why did he do that? I think there's probably two reasons. Number one, because it was possible within his tenure. So it was a thing that he could actually do and show that he'd done it. But also, number two, it made sense to people. Like, it's very easy to understand your rent getting frozen. Like, whereas the idea of abolishing landlords is just, it's a very difficult thing for people to conceptualize. Like, again, I was talking to the guy that pushed this motion, and he had some councillors come into him afterwards saying, well, look, what am I going to do with this on the doorstep? I can't talk about abolishing landlords on the doorstep. And the guy said to him, well, look, I didn't really pass it for that. It was just more of a media thing. Like, I didn't really pass it for you to like write on your leaflets locally. But there's just that separation between media and local campaigning just doesn't exist. Like, that's not a thing. Most people experience political parties through the media, not through real people in real life. And thus, frankly, I think we need to have more discipline than this. And, you know, we don't just need to cite Zoran Mamdani. You have my favourite other crutch, the Belgian Workers' Party. And you also have Die Linke in Germany, who have actually come up with policy processes which they take members' concerns and members' interests seriously, but then they go to the people and they find out what people are actually talking about and the things that people really care about. And then they come up with a focused, concentrated program based on those things. And I just think that, you know, that with regards to policy, that needs to be our focus. I think a lot of these motions don't actually really make the party any more quote unquote socialist. Like, as I say, with abolish landlords, it didn't actually change the policy of the party because this was already housing, like the housing policy that's within that motion was already policy of the party. The point of it was to create a furore. I think there are better ways of building a socialist party. And I do, like, you know, I'm not just saying we need to sacrifice everything for winning an election. We need to win an election with a party that is avowedly socialist and will carry through socialist policies and program. But I think the places to focus are not passing radical sounding policy motions at conference and making a big furore. I think the places to focus are making sure we actually select loads and loads and loads of candidates who are actually socialists to be MPs. There's a massive danger in the Green Party that we're going to select loads of Liberals and Social Democrats to be MPs and who are going to be very afraid to actually like carry through a lot of the policy if they ever get anywhere near government. I actually think that like focusing on increasing the activity levels of members and how deeply embedded members are in communities is far more important than past. And I think that like if you want to work on policy, I think like working as part of the long-term policy working groups, which exist within the Green Party and people can join, rather than passing these kind of like big controversial policy motions that don't create an argument that's on our terms, I think that's a far better way of doing it. And I think I'll finish with saying that I do think there's a role for conference and passing motions to build a socialist party. But I think they're a lot more focused in the rule changes and the structure of the party. And, you know, there's one motion going to the spring conference, which I think is brilliant. That's come from the left that unfortunately I don't think will get heard because I don't think it ended up high enough up the agenda, which is about making sure that MPs only get paid a worker's wage. So they only get paid, you know, the equivalent of a worker's wage.
Yes.
I think this is an absolutely such an important thing for the party to do.
100%.
Number one, it kills like the careerist desire. Like you end up with people who actually like feel like being an MP is a vocation, not just like a career. Number two, it is just such an immediate signal to people out in the country that you are different to every other single politician and every other single MP. There's some anecdotal evidence that it works really well as a cut-through point. Like Nadia Whittome got a ton of press coverage when she decided to take a carer's wage. She was previously a carer. Andrea Egan, the new Unison General Sec, was a carer. She takes a worker's wage. She's just won Unison General Election. I'm not saying it's all down to that, but I do know it's very popular with members. That's a fantastic thing to pass by a conference. And I just think, yeah, if the left's going to have like a focus on conferences in the Green Party and motions, I would love it to be on that stuff. And I would like it to move away from, I think, kind of like trying to assert the party's radicalism through controversial policy.
I cannot tell you how much I disagree.
Oh, good. Let's go.
This is a Joe versus Shanice spectacle, bruv. What are we saying?
I'm here for it.
Nah, do you know what? I made that sound more extreme than it actually is. But,
don't bottle it now.
No, don't bottle it. Come on.
But I do think I fundamentally disagree on the idea that radical ideas are a hindrance. I actually think in the current context, they're a huge benefit. I think part of what defines our current political moment is the collapsing of the centre and the stories and the narratives that the centre tells about prosperity and how politics works and how the economics should work and, you know, what society should look like. And I think that has largely come from neoliberalism's inability to back up its narratives on how the world should work with actual kind of material reality. You know, people's living standards are collapsing and falling. All the stories that you're told about if you work hard, then you'll be able to live well, all collapsing, all nonsense. And I think in that context, people are looking for new ideas. They're not looking for the same old status quo politics, the same politicians who tell a safe story about what prosperity looks like and how we have to make difficult decisions. But if you just stick with it, you'll feel the benefits. People are looking to the extremes of politics on both the right and the left for new ideas and answers. And by and large, you know, the right have been more successful in places than the left at telling these stories of both, you know, stories that monopolize and feed off of grievance, but also stories that are in some ways about renewal. I see this in both the fact that the two right-wing parties in Britain at the moment are called Reform, things need to change, and Restore, things need to change. And, you know, politics at the moment is defined by this idea that things just cannot stay how they are. And actually, in that context, for me, bold leadership, politicians who are able to say, no, we're going to scrap all these typical ways of doing things or the usual stories and narratives, and we're going to put forward new ideas. I think that actually has struck with people. And I think, you know, the conversation that we had last episode about drug policy is an example of that. You know, the immediate response to people is to be quite squeamish. You know, this is a difficult conversation to have. Obviously, drugs are bad. Obviously, they should be illegal. But actually, Zach Polanski really held his own when he was doing kind of the media tours, and journalists were bringing this up and trying to catch him out, and they were largely failing. You know, he had a strong position and a strong line, and he was able to hold it and he was able to defend it. And I think we need more of that, not less. I think the second point is, though, that I actually don't think this particular motion is an example of a radical motion. Zionism is racism isn't a new concept. It used to be official UN policy in 1975. It was voted in, pissed off Israel so much they spent nearly 20 years campaigning, and in 1991 it was finally abolished. And I think there's something insurgent and symbolic about the Green Party being able to bring back what was consensus a few decades ago, being able to bring that back onto the agenda. And I think finally, you know, you mentioned Zohran Mamdani, and I think the case of Zohran Mamdani shows the opposite of what you argued. From my reading, Zohran Mamdani's theories of change was we need to win enough electorally. We need to achieve enough electoral hegemony by appealing both to traditional Democrats, but also to our activist base. And so there's questions of, well, what do you gain and what do you lose there? So one of the things that he lost was, well, in order to appeal to existing and traditional Democrats, we're going to have to soften our tone and soften some of our language and some of our on key questions that drive and motivate our activist base. So we're not going to use the word abolition. We're not going to use the word defund. We're not going to call the NYPD racist. So we cede ground there. We cede ideological ground. But then the payoff is you could win power. And he did win power. But he also married that with radical policies that did appeal to the activist base and kept that activist base on board. So he maintained the critique of carceral systems, by actually saying that we're going to get rid of the strategic response group. So although he didn't say we're going to abolish landlords, he did say that we're going to abolish the strategic response group. He did say that we're going to abolish Rikers Island. And he did say only a couple of weeks ago, abolish ICE. So, it's not the case that he's completely abandoned his radicalism. It's a fine balancing game, isn't it? Because, for me as an abolitionist, my as I said, I'm a principles gal. So my immediate response to a politician softening their line on something is, well, that's unprincipled. And, it kind of is. But then I'm thinking, well, actually, if we can get into some of these state structures and make it more likely that we'll be able to pass radical policy, and, for example, make it more likely that we could in the future really reduce the power of the NYPD because we've got socialists in those positions of power. And in order to do that, maybe we need to soften our language here or there. Yes, we do cede ideological ground. We shouldn't pretend that that's not the case, but possibly we can gain something in the future. And I think that is a balancing act of holding a coalition together. The Zionism is racism motion. Well, what do we lose? Zionists. So what? And the reality is most people don't think of their politics on foreign affairs in terms of these, theoretical words. It's probably the case that most people don't think of politics in terms of Zionism or anti-Zionism. So how relevant is it even that language even going to be to most people? But the benefits could be that you keep your coalition on board, you appeal to Gaza voters, you don't marginalize your activist base who's going to do a lot of your field work for you, and you're able to keep that delicate coalition together. So yes, you might have to do a lot of defending in the media, and that might have you on the back foot a little bit. But actually, I think the question is in terms of what we lose and what we gain. And I think with something like Zionism is racism, which it just plainly is, don't think I really see your argument here.
Oh, Jonas.
I really want to get your face on a T-shirt with "I'm a principles gal" underneath. I'm really interested to know, Joe, about the workers' wage motion being pushed from the left, even if it might not be seen at the conference. That's really, really encouraging. And just as a sidebar to our last conversation, there might be a kind of obstacle to Labour MPs wanting to be in the Greens if they're going to lose some money. But,
exactly.
Well, yeah, for sure.
So much to say here. I think about Corbynism, right? Particularly that period from 2017 to 2019, where lots of people were under the illusion that the project was in the ascendancy, where, we could kind of just pull the big lever again and do 2017 all over again, if you like.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah.
Voting day was horrible.
Yeah. It
was me too.
And, I'm very keen that we kind of have that kind of like assessment of Corbynism at some point sooner. I know we've got plans to. But for me, the problem wasn't that the motions were passed. Lots of radical motions between 2017 and 2019 were passed. Wasn't necessarily a problem, but the fact that the project had been delegitimated publicly, it had become kind of ensconced in constitutional negotiations. Corbyn had been kind of stripped of his outsider status, turned into a conventional politician in some ways, but also at the same time monstered as an enemy of the nation, right? There was this kind of dual thing going on. And part of the problem for me was at the 2019 election campaign, because the project had become so exhausted politically and organizationally in all sorts of ways, never had a meaningful story. There was never a sense, for example, unlike 2017, of who was going to pay for all of these reforms that was front-loaded right at the beginning of the campaign. There was never a compelling counter-story over Brexit. So policy that is actually quite popular and has only gotten more popular since 2019, like, for example, a 4-day working week, feels really loosely assembled. It feels really easy to monster, to pick apart, to say this is nonsense. And so you get an instance, for example, where, and this is really important for me, like the Brexit, right, in this kind of environment of capitalist realism becomes much more vengefully tangible for people who have gone through all the horrors of Thatcherism than a radical left program. And that's important, right? Because lots of people who had gone through all of the horrors of Thatcherism and had no experience of winning things for 20 to 30 years didn't think a radical left program was possible, so they went for Brexit. Okay, we need experiences where people win things. And so this is where I'm in between the two of you a little bit. Is like if we're not gonna fight for experiences where people actually can win things on the ground through organizing initiatives, some of the policy, some of the kind of policy claims can seem aloof, like they don't necessarily connect. And I think that's something real. They don't crack capitalist realism. And that's one of our central motifs in politics today, right? A friend once remarked to me, not once, like a few months ago, that there's a danger on the left, even in these big political institutions, that you imagine this kind of extensive, deep social world around your political party, that kind of world still exists if you're in the Labour Party, and that, you enact the direction of your motion at a conference or you win a particular internal victory in your party. Then there's a lack of realization. This is in Labour. This has definitely played a role in your party, that you have to lay the ground for these political positions with a broader social world that your politics is seeking to construct that might not exist yet. You're trying to subjectivate people through joint activity, through stronger political interventions. And this is the kind of work of building a majoritarian politics. And I do worry, this is where I agree with Joe, I do worry that for a younger generation of radicals that there's an error made in thinking mass support in the attention economy is easily translated into majoritarian politics. I do have that worry. And I think that comes from this constant sway we do that I've referenced quite a bit here, where we have movements one day and then we have elections the next. And the electoral schemas often come in the kind of exhaustion of those movements. So, for some people, the capitalist realism dynamic is only further entrenched because we haven't actually won anything. And I worry about that dynamic because I think in part it comes a little bit from a pessimism about what's actually possible in the class struggle more broadly. So I'll leave that there. But I think where I totally agree with Shanice, I just don't think the Zionism as racism motion is maximalist or particularly declarative at all, really. Like, I think, counterfactuals are not always the most useful thing, right? But I think if, as they were advised by Palestinian organizers at the time, Corbyn's leadership and the kind of wider outrider left in those years had the gumption to try and repivot the anti-Semitism crisis under Corbynism around an anti-racist story rather than the kind of defensive story it ended up with, like, I think it may have put the movement on a better footing by putting anti-racism front and center against a cynical political center. Whether we think that's feasible at the time, fair enough. That's a different question. But I do think there is a strong case for saying that our political interventions should try to cleave open the space created by mass movements and hold the line in a way that I think, frankly, Polanski, as the Jewish leader of the Green Party, and it's a source of sadness for me that things sometimes get reduced to this level of crude cynicism, is well placed to do. I do just think that's a cold, hard political fact. So I think this particular motion is sound. Like, I basically think the pivot is relatively smart. It frames the settler colonial project, firstly, as a supremacist one. So it seeks to nullify the claims of anti-Semitism. It seeks to repivot the conversation about racism onto the settler colonial state itself. I think that's a good first starting premise. And it grounds out a perspective with a commitment to Palestinian self-determination in a moment when more and more people back that and despise Israel. And I mean more and more people despise Israel today as they chuck loads of bombs in Iran and kill loads of civilians, right? I mean, like, this stuff is like, people do not like the state of Israel increasingly. And I just think, like, we should recognize that. So for me, like, the maximalism stuff is like, it isn't always a no-no, right? It's just contingent, right? It's contingent on what's possible in any given situation. Yeah. And I think the Zionism is racism one, the space of contingency is open more because you've had that social movement over the last few years. Whereas I agree, like with the abolished landlords one, I'm not convinced that space is as open to have that kind of declarative message from the start, even though all the policy is completely sound, as we've all agreed. There is another thing here where, like, I do wonder, like, we have to recognize how in flux compared to the 20th century, the contemporary left is today. Like, in terms of political traditions, like we've talked about it, like we couldn't really pin down what Zach Polanski's political tradition is, for example, right? And I bet that's just the case for loads of people, right? I don't say this as a judgment, right? We've said many a times we're the weirdos, right? We have political traditions, we're the oddballs. And I think like you see that in these moments, right? Where people want to participate in these mass electoral projects, but at the same time they want to marry an emancipatory language into that mass electoral project. And sometimes it's uneasy. Sometimes it's not always strategically thought through. And I guess the task of politics in these formations is to work out how you do that best and how you do that combination the best. Because, I'm sympathetic to some of your reservations about it, Joe.
So much to say. So much to say. I mean, look, I actually do want to just start by saying that I respect all the people that are really pushing these motions. You know what I mean? Like, sure. I totally understand where they're coming from. So I really want people to hear this as like, like a really solid critique or like that. I think they're bad people. Like, I just really, really don't. And I'm really glad that we don't all agree, actually, because it's just gonna make for a far better kind of podcast and conversation. I think also where I'm coming from is just that I was part of that 2017 to 2019 phase where we pushed lots of radical policy motions at a Labour conference in 2019. I worked for Momentum at that time, and I was one of a group of people, some in Momentum, some outside, who basically were just a bit distrustful of the leadership and specifically the unions around the leadership, thinking that they were going to water down the manifesto, what could possibly be in the manifesto, and we'd end up with something relatively social democratic and less like socialist, essentially. And we saw conference as a way of leveraging Jeremy and the leadership's commitment to member democracy to basically like bounce them into including this radical stuff in the manifesto. And one of the ways we wanted to do that was to use the press to create these, like these furores, and the climate motion was a big one. I think abolish private schools was the one that probably went the biggest in the press. And I'm actually sympathetic with your emphasis there, Jonas, in that I do think that one of the problems with the radical policy motions was that it led to an overly long manifesto that was a bit disconnected from people's everyday experience, and it emphasized members' desires in the party more than it emphasized like the working class or the people out there's desires. I think that was a problem. But it was also just one of focus as well. Like, we had so many incredible activists focused on what is the Labour Party's programme for government going to be, and like what's going to go in the manifesto, whilst Jeremy Corbyn's personal approval ratings were absolutely underwater. And actually, by any kind of like, by any sound analysis of the situation, it was going to be very, very hard to win the next election against Boris Johnson. And if you look back at the polling ratings for either Labour or Jeremy, that was quite clear after Johnson got in that it would be like really, really hard to beat him in an election. Yeah. And I think a lot of us just shut our eyes to that, to be honest, because we didn't want to countenance that. And I know it's not a direct analog to now. I really appreciate that it's not a direct analog to now. But I just wonder if some people are shutting their eyes a little bit to what it's actually going to take for the Green Party to do some of the things we want it to do. And one of those things is for the Green Party to win a fucking majority. And that's going to be really hard. And we've got a long way to go as a party to get into the low 30s. You know what I mean? So I think that's like, I know there's a little bit of like default into electoralism there, but at the end of the day, like, these projects are electoral projects, and what they're trying to do is enter government and do stuff with all of the difficulties and compromises that come with that. I think just to respond to some of Shanice's points, like I agree. I think now is the time for radical policy, because I think the status quo is completely fucked. I would just be more particular and specific with regards to which radical policies and which radical slogans that accompany those policies are actually going to be popular and which aren't. And maybe I make the distinction between like radical policy fronted by popular slogan. Maybe that is the kind of like distinction I'm trying to make. And just to give an example, like a very radical thing to propose at the moment in the UK context would be price controls, right? On basic, I mean, a rent cap is a price control, but price controls on other basic goods and stuff. Quite radical price controls on fuel and petrol, things like that. I think if you polled that would be really, really popular. I don't know the economics of actually achieving it. I'm not an economist, but I think if you polled that'd be really, really popular. And I think if it were a viable thing and if it would actually help, then that's the kind of thing you could campaign on. You could talk about really well on the doorstep, and it'd be really exciting. Like that. That's the kind of slogan that I want us to be coming up with and I want us to be campaigning on, which is very radical, but I also think very popular. To take one from the other side of the thing, open borders, for instance. Like, I believe in open borders. One of my favorite books I've ever read was a Kim Stanley Robinson series called Red, Green, and Blue Mars.
Oh,
And
so good.
This is linked, I promise. And I think there's one bit of it, basically like loads of left wing people move to Mars and terraform it. And there's one bit of it where he's just describing what it's like to live on Mars, and it's this borderless society where you move from like town to town and village to village, and there's always somewhere for you to stay, and you can get involved in the collective life and work of the commune. And there's this one amazing one where they just love paragliding off cliffs, and they spend all of their time just like paragliding in these like beautiful places. So like, I really like, spiritually, I'm an open borders person, but like, I just don't think we can put it in a manifesto. I don't think we can put it on a leaflet. So I don't think we can talk to people about it on the doorstep, because like, unfortunately, our politics have to meet the reality of where people are at in the way that Jonas was saying. So I just do think there are some very radical things we can run on, but I just don't think all radical things are good for the moment just because the status quo is falling apart. And then my final things, more specifically on the Zionism as racism motion, because I really appreciate your guys' points, and I think it is important to distinguish between the Abolish Land Laws motion and the Zionism as racism motion. I guess with the Zionism as racism motion, I am more worried about the anti-Semitism attack line. And, you know, maybe it's because I was so close to Corbynism and I just saw Corbynism get completely destroyed by that. But I'm worried that we just think that because Zach's Jewish, it's all going to be fine.
For sure.
And yes, I think like attacking Zach on the basis of anti-Semitism is incredibly hard because of his identity, but attacking in the way that they did in Labour members of the party who have said certain things and yada yada, and I just worry that some motions like this may kick off kind of escalating stories of that nature again. When if we're trying to portray ourselves as like the successor to Labour and the replacement of Labour, then looking unified and coherent and outward facing is just incredibly important.
I mean, I definitely hear where you're coming from, but there's a couple of words that you used, popular, and I have a problem with the idea of what is popular and what is not. Number one, because these things shift very, very rapidly. And number two, because kind of what is currently the status quo, well, it's not us setting that agenda, right? And we have to ask, well, who's setting the agenda of what is popular and where people are at? And I think of the question of mass forced deportations. The idea of mass forced deportations of Black and brown people was unthinkable 10 years ago. If you even raised the notion of mass deportations, you'd have the liberal and centre establishment calling you a fascist, rightly, because it is fascist. And now we have a whole new political party called Restore, whose entire policy platform is mass deportations. They've written a 100-page manifesto on exactly how they're going to do it. So they've got all the practicalities in place. And they're cleaving votes from reform, and they're considered, I mean, they haven't quite broken through the mainstream yet, but they're considered a legitimate political force. And, that shift has taken place because the right wing have pushed radical ideas over years, again and again and again, and, shifted the Overton window. They've changed what is acceptable. And actually, if you listen to far, far right, so real unapologetic Nazis and how they talk about this process, they explicitly say that we need to say the most extreme, the most racist, the most radical things online, in videos, in popular culture, on social media, so that the thing that is slightly less radical but helps us meet our goals becomes more palatable in the mainstream. And it's the classic tactic. And I think, part of the reason why we have this sense that we shouldn't talk about open borders, for example, even though there are really good practical arguments for open borders, strong practical arguments economically, socially, environmentally for why open borders is good. And the reason why we don't acknowledge that, by the way, capitalists have open borders and capital moves through open borders. The reason why we don't talk about that is because when we do talk about it, we're squeamish. We're like, open borders, but I understand people's concerns, or open borders and I see why people... No, open borders is good. Open borders is good for people. Open borders is good for the economy. Open borders is good for the environment. Let's make the positive case. And let's think strategically about this. We have two parties. We have the Green Party and we have your party. Instead of these two parties vying for the same seats, could actually a successful electoral left flank look like? It could look like your party making these bold arguments, or the Green Party or someone making these bold arguments that seem extreme, but are well defended, well articulated, told with good storytelling behind it. And then having the electoral project that's like, okay, we might not go that far, but we're going to push the dial a bit. And similarly, with the question of anti-Zionism and Zionism is racism, historically, the idea that Zionism is racism is a socialist Jewish position. It originated with the socialists of the Bund, who argued that this idea that we would colonize Palestine or colonize anywhere else and kick people out to establish a Jewish homeland was racist. And in fact, the status quo amongst Jews in the early 1900s was that Zionism was a colonial and racist project. And obviously we've come so far from that position. But I think we cede so much ground. And I think we have to stop ceding this ground, because the only reason why, we feel squeamish about some of our ideas is because the right is winning. And I'm not sure we should base all of our politics on the fact of the right winning. It is the reality, but I'm not sure how much we should be drawn by that.
So Shanice, look, like just to come directly back on the stuff around the right and how the right have socialised certain ideas, I do think we actually agree on this. I think we agree in that you pointed to how the right, certain elements of the right in like influencers or TV news or like the more hardcore bits of the right are like, we need to say the most like racist, horrible things possible to then like normalize the thing that is just like a bit to their left. We need to do this completely the same thing on the left. We need outriders, organizations, influencers, publications, whatever, to be pushing like really radical ideas that are, as you say, like really well argued. But my argument would be is that like that's not the Green Party's primary role, because the Green Party are trying to win an election. Like, a media commentator is not trying to win an election. An activist campaign group are not trying to win an election. Their job is to create the media furore, push really radical ideas, and then make it more possible for political parties such as the Green Party to move into that position. Like, as Jonas said before, do the groundwork. And I think, I think this sense of movement ecology is really, really, really integral to this. Like, the Green Party will really benefit from having like basically this like left flank that who aren't trying to get elected themselves. And there's really interesting examples with this in the climate movement, where when Extinction Rebellion blew up in 2018, I think, can't quite remember when, Greenpeace got a ton of donations. Greenpeace got loads and loads and loads of donations because XR blew up, and there were a load of people that looked at XR and thought, oh, that's a bit like scary or radical for me or whatever. But then they looked at the thing that's like slightly more acceptable, which is Greenpeace, and then gave loads of money to Greenpeace. So they just benefited hugely. And I just think that it's just like really important to think of it in those terms. And it's like, how do we enable the Green Party to be more radical? How do we enable Zach to go further? It is by organisations that aren't the Green Party making the arguments for this stuff and laying that groundwork.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a few things here, right? We've said this before, I've said this before, but we really do have to reinforce the idea that the Greens have not seen nothing yet in terms of the state going for them, in terms of the media going for them, in terms of just panics about what threat they represent to the state, to capital, to the culture of the country, to the civilization of the country, right? We really just haven't seen anything yet. Like the Gorton and Denton by-election with the vans running around saying that Hannah and Zach are going to give your kids crack is just like a taste, basically. And it's going to get
That's
much
such a good
worse.
bar, though.
Yeah.
Hannah and Zach are going to give your kids crack. That's good.
And it demonstrates the importance of like this kind of movement ecology that I think you both basically agree on, right? Which is that you need different flanks of a movement to defend each other in different ways and to try and push the Overton window open a little bit further. Obviously, and then it's this question about like, but the terrain in the Greens is seemingly quite open, right? And so there are going to be these kind of fights about like, how do we radicalize policy at the same time as we have this kind of electoralist agenda? And that raises a bunch of questions for the Greens. That it raises questions about, is 2029 the time to take office? Like, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it does raise that question, right? If you want to have more radical policy and you want to have a more radical agenda, you have to try and build that in over a prolonged period of time. And maybe that prolonged period of time isn't 20 or 29. I'm just saying that, right? I'm just putting that out there. I think for me, like, this really highlights the need to think transitionally. Like, and that will be uncomfortable for people on the left sometimes, I think. Like, what are the transitional demands that we have in terms of migration policy? Because there's ways in which I think, like, just like go fully internationalist, and I'm always a bit uneasy with the language of open borders, like because I prefer the left's older language of opposition to all immigration controls, because that for me points to like a more of a class dimension in terms of migration, right? Where it's just like, oh, there's this group of elites who get to go wherever they want, and their money gets to go wherever they want, and the slogan of open borders kind of obfuscates that a little bit. Whereas opposition to all immigration controls, I think, is a better way to square that. But that's not a transitional demand either, right? That is opposition to all of the controls that make lives for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers miserable in this country.
Jonas, do you want to define transitional demand? I think it might be...
yeah, for sure, absolutely. I think that's really important. For me, it's like we have our struggles in the present. So, for example, I don't think a price control is a transitional demand, right? A price control on food is not a transitional demand. I think that is something that could happen and that we could fight for in the here and now, a deliverable reform, if you like. Whereas a transitional demand for me would be something that connects the question of a deliverable reform to a broader questioning of the system at large. So other people would call this a non-reformist reform in a different lexicon. And I think it's important to sit on that terrain. Whether the Greens are going to be the people that sit on that terrain is a different question, because it's an electoralist party. But I think, for me, that's the kind of strategic jump that the radical left, inside and outside of the Greens, has to make a bit, right? Is we can do the outriding bit, really important. We need to do the organising bit, centrally important for me. But we do also need, across those different bits, to argue for policies that go beyond simple deliverable reforms and that question the broader cultural and structural logics of the system, but without saying let's abolish the system in its entirety. Like, we need that connective tissue in the way that we think about politics. We need that sequencing, and we need to fight for that sequencing in the Greens, I think, because I think that's in some areas that is possible. I wouldn't have a blanket kind of suggestion that it's possible all of the time, because again, I think these things are contingent based on like the balance of class forces and all of these different questions. But I think that's the way in which we need to think about these questions. Okay, so you heard it here first. Joe doesn't think the left is comms brains enough, and Shanice thinks we all need to be principles gals.
Yeah.
I mean that's not a bad way of describing him.
And Jonas is very diplomatically somewhere in the middle.
I mean, you guys can't see it, but on our like little podcasting like recording screen, Jonas is literally in the middle, so it's quite. And I'm on the right, which is so annoying.
I'm the maximalist.
Yeah. And finally, to round out and say goodbye to you lovely listeners, we're going to talk about what we've been reading or listening to over the past couple of weeks. Shanice, hit us.
So I'm going to recommend a book that is both relevant to the conversations that we've been having today, but also is close to my heart for other reasons of being someone that I know and love and respect. And it's a book called Scattered by Amna Modine. Amna Modine is a Guardian journalist, has done some incredible work as their community correspondent, did like sensational work around the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-fascist movement. And the book Scattered, The Making and Unmaking of a Refugee, is her story of making it from a refugee camp as a young child to the shores of Britain, and how that journey happened and what it's meant for her. And I think it just fits in so nicely with the themes that we were talking about today around borders, racism. And actually, I think it's a book that brings those theoretical conversations to life. Sometimes I don't think we acknowledge enough how these questions that we're having around strategy, around comms, around theory, around principles are actually ultimately about people's lives. And sometimes it's good to kind of read books that ground the left and our ideas in actual experiences. So yeah, definitely check out Amna Modine's Scattered.
Yeah, I second that. It's one of my favourite books, and it's, like you say, Shanice, it's just totally rich in life.
Yeah.
Both funny, everything about it. Yeah, second that. Joe, what you got for us?
So I started reading, basically I'm going on holiday soon, so I just went on The Guardian and was like, 100 best books ever to see if there's anything that I want to read. And I picked a couple, and one of the ones that I picked was Yanis Varoufakis's book called Adults in the Room, My Battle with Europe's Deep Establishment, which is about when he was the finance minister of Greece during the Greek debt crisis, and Syriza were kind of at their height. And it's just Varoufakis at his most kind of gossipy and engaging, to be honest. Like you get to see behind the scenes of him negotiating with the Troika and having these kind of like mad bilateral meetings with Larry Summers and other people, and his kind of meditations on what it means to be an insider and an outsider, and trying to kind of like head up an insurgent force, but nevertheless having to deal with the establishment in various ways, and when to negotiate, when to tap out, when to maximize, when to minimize. And just feels like there's a lot of lessons for a left that might be a few years away from government potentially, and a lot of lessons for a left that is kind of at least like electorally getting kind of quote unquote back into the room, I think. Yeah, so I'm just really enjoying it, and I'd really recommend it.
Amazing. Yeah, this week I'm a fiction king. I'm reading Thomas Pynchon's Vineland. So it's a book which provides a lot of the source material for Paul Thomas Anderson's latest film, One Battle After Another. I really love the film, like kind of depiction of anti-capitalist rebellion, the pace set and the cinematography. Like there was so much good going for it. So I thought I'd give the book a read, and it's just a really cool depiction of the kind of defeated left in 80s California, kind of dealing with these kind of dual calamities of state repression and cultural absorption. And it has this really subtle but quite profound way of like tracing the different ways in which Californian counterculture is overwhelmed by like Nixon, Reaganism, repression, job insecurity, real estate. There's always this problem of replicating books into films, but I think the book gave a depth to the female characters that was only really hinted at in the film, and I quite appreciated that. So I really recommend the book and the film. I think both of them in their own ways express something quite profound about leaving one world and entering a new one, if you like.
Nice.
Okay, Good work, guys. That's it until next time. Find us on Instagram and Twitter, or apparently it's called X now. Email us at podlifeoftheparty@gmail.com with your thoughts, or let us know what you thought of the show by getting us on the comments on Spotify and Apple. Laters.
I mean, no one seriously calls it X, so
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
See you later, guys.
Bye.
This is an Amper Sounds production.